Take revenge on my wife for me.
These were the startling words in a letter I received from my dearly departed son, just 13 days after his sudden passing. He had been living a happy, married life.
Take revenge on my wife for me.
Below the written words, there was an address I did not recognize. John, are you telling me to go to this place? As I pondered, tears stopped, but cold sweat broke out. I couldn't imagine my son, John, ever speaking of revenge. What drove him to this point? What could I possibly discover at this address? I had been shut inside my home since a funeral ended, but I quickly left my house. I was so absorbed that I even forgot to put on makeup. But that didn't matter. I wanted to fulfill my beloved son's wish. With a single-minded focus, I hurried to the address written in the letter. The place John specified in his letter was a rental storage facility, a bit away from our home. Among the rows of warehouses, I found the one with the number mentioned in the letter. I inserted the thin, small key attached to the letter into the lock and opened the door of the warehouse. The small room, about the size of 100 square feet max, was dimly lit and slightly musty, despite it being daytime. When I pressed the switch next to the door, the bare fluorescent light buzzed and lit up the interior. What is this? Instinctive fear took hold of me, and my entire body started trembling. My name is Susan Garcia. I am a 54-year-old part-time employee. I lost my beloved husband 20 years ago. He mentioned feeling slightly unwell and then passed away shortly after. It was so sudden, I still find it hard to believe. He wasn't seriously ill and always had regular health checkups. Yet, he left me and our son, John. Since my husband's death, it was just John and me. Back then, John was still in elementary school, struggling more than anyone with his father's sudden departure. My in-laws frequently visited to help with John. Responding to our feelings, it seemed like John was desperately trying to hide his loneliness from not having a father. Far from that, John often encouraged me when I became panicked. "Mom, it's okay, I'm here." His young voice still echoes in my ears to this day. After losing my husband, I started working part-time to raise John, trying to forget the sorrow with the busyness of daily life. He never said anything about me being frequently away from home due to my busy job. Despite being lonely himself, he never complained and continued to encourage me. I gradually overcame my grief, responding to John's support. During his high school years, John began working part-time to help with our finances. He worked while balancing his studies, not wanting to overburden me. He did well academically, often praised by teachers at parent-teacher conference. I am thankful every day for how well he grew up despite losing his father. After graduating high school, John immediately started working. He had good enough grades for any university, but probably considering me, he made his decision. Saying, "I'm tired of studying," he started working at a small local factory. Being naturally smart, John quickly learned the ropes and was well liked by everyone there. Despite the physical demands, he seemed fulfilled every day. About 6 months later, John got a girlfriend. Previously a homebody on his days off, he started going out almost every weekend. As a mom, I felt a bit lonely, but I was also relieved that my son at that age had found someone. Above all, John looked happy, and that made me glad. He had always been considerate of me, supporting me. I hope he thinks of his own happiness now. I watched over his relationship from a distance. When John turned 27, he decided to get married. His fiancée was a woman 2 years his senior named Sarah. When they got engaged, Sarah came along with John to meet me. She was a striking beauty with distinct features, a contrast to the rather plain John. I was surprised not only that John brought such a woman home, but also that they met at a social drinking event. I was surprised by this unknown side of my beloved son, but I didn't have a bad impression of Sarah. She worked in sales at a cosmetics company. Maybe it was her job, but she was a great conversationalist, and our meeting ended on a pleasant note. Soon after, they got married, and John moved out to live with Sarah.
Mom, are you sure you'll be okay alone? It's still within the county, but a bit far.
John worried about me until the last minute before moving. Sarah too seemed concerned about me living alone, and there was serious talk about us living together at one point. I appreciated their kindness, but I couldn't burden John any further. I politely declined their offer and celebrated their new life together. John still visited me often, but he started to lose weight, seemingly stressed from his job change. He chose a new job closer to Sarah's workplace, but it seemed to be tough on him. Unlike the small factory, the unfamiliar sales job was probably causing him stress and affecting his appetite. Haven't you lost weight? It's good to work hard, but it's serious if you ruin your health. Every time he came home, I would say that to John, but he would just reply, I'm fine, with no intention of changing jobs. I assumed his job was the only stressor, but it took me a while to realize there was more to it. Sarah, since he won't listen to me, could you talk to him? He's so stubborn. 3 years after John and Sarah got married, John turned 30. By that time, John's complexion had worsened, and he seemed to be at the brink of his physical limits. I repeatedly asked him, why don't you change jobs without overstraining yourself? But John stubbornly refused. It could be because of his marriage to Sarah that he feels he can't quit his job right now out of a sense of responsibility. Unable to bear it, I reached out to Sarah, asking her to persuade John to consider a job change. Sarah, visibly worried about John's declining health, tearfully apologized to me, and she was saying, it was my fault. It's not your fault, Sarah. John has always been a hard worker and tends to overdo things, but I think he'll listen more if it comes from you. But I was not gonna lie, I was somewhat irritated with Sarah. Despite my repeated requests to take care of John, she seemed to do nothing but only apologize. I couldn't blame her directly, so I could only watch as John continued to decline. Several days after contacting Sarah, I still hadn't heard anything from her. She should know how worried I am. I thought she should give me at least an update. Due to worrying about John, I find myself getting irritated over trivial things. Calming myself down, I decided to reach out and contact her myself. "Hey, Sarah, have you talked to John about what we discussed?" I asked cautiously. After a brief pause, an unbelievable response came from her. No, it wasn't words I heard on the phone. It was a click of the tongue. On the other end, Sarah definitely made that sound.
"I'm sorry, Susan, but I'm also busy with work. I'm keeping a close eye on John's health. Aren't you being a bit overprotective? If he says he's okay, then he must be okay,"
Sarah retorted with irritation. This tone was unlike the Sarah I knew, but it was undeniably her. Had she been pretending until now? Stunned into silence, I heard Sarah regain some composure.
"Sorry, I'm just worried and getting frustrated too."
Despite her attempts to smooth things over, my guard against her didn't drop. For the first time, I sensed danger from Sarah. John might be in danger with her. An awful premonition raced through my mind, but with John himself saying nothing, I couldn't interfere in his affairs with Sarah. He was due to visit in a few days, so maybe I should ask him more directly then. Could he be troubled by something other than work? Some serious issue in his marriage? As Sarah pointed out, I might be a bit too overprotective. But if it's just a conversation when he comes to visit, that should be okay. Just to listen, after all. I managed to calm my racing heart and waited for John's visit. But my decision was a grave mistake, one I would regret for the rest of my life. It happened so suddenly.
"Is this Mrs. Susan, John's mother?"
The call from the police gripped my heart painfully. A dreadful feeling pierced me, and I nearly fainted. It can't be. Before the officer could even state their business, my mind raced with the worst scenarios. Part of me desperately denied it, yet somewhere there was also a feeling of resignation. I didn't want to hear any more. Fighting the urge to hang up, I nodded. As expected, they informed me of John's death. He had taken his own life.
"Please, stay calm."
They kept saying, but I dropped the phone. I was in such shock, I forgot to even cry, standing dumbfounded. "Why, John?" I repeated his name over and over, as if broken. How much time had passed? The sound of the front door being forcefully knocked brought me back to reality. Concerned about the disconnected call, several police officers had come to check on me. I crawled to the door and opened it. Seeing the officers' sorrowful faces, I finally broke down and cried. A female officer accompanied them, embracing me as she cried along. This is real. John is gone. That's how I lost my beloved son. Overwhelmed with grief, I went through the funeral proceedings, but my memory of it is mostly a blur. I had even forgotten my anger towards Sarah, focusing solely on what needed to be done. There were many things I wanted to say, to talk about, but at that moment, I couldn't do any of it. The police, seeing my condition, decided to postpone their inquiry for a while. During that time, the police seemed to be questioning Sarah, but I doubted she would reveal anything. My intuition told me Sarah was the reason behind John's downfall. Why didn't I contact John right away? Why didn't I go to him immediately? Regrets flooded my heart, and I found myself unable to talk to anybody for a while. Then a letter arrived for me. My hands trembled as I saw the sender's. John's name. The handwriting was unmistakably his. John was supposed to have passed away 13 days ago. In a panic, I rushed back to my room and tore open the envelope. Tears naturally flowed as I clutched John's letter. It must have been written by him before his passing. Without a suicide note, the true cause was shrouded in darkness, and I was afraid to read the contents. However, this letter might reveal what happened to John. The cause that had been eating away at him for years. The letter, opened with trembling hands, was filled with words of gratitude towards me. My body shook uncontrollably, and sobs overcame me. Why couldn't I save John? Why? The same questions circled in my mind. As I tried to return the letter to the envelope, I noticed another piece of paper inside. What's this? I unfolded the letter and couldn't believe the words written on it.
Take revenge on my wife for me.
Below the words was an unfamiliar address. John, are you telling me to go to this place? The tears had stopped, but now cold sweat broke out. I couldn't imagine John ever speaking of revenge. He must have been driven to the edge. What could I find at this address? I had been cooped up at home since the funeral, but now I immediately left, forgetting even to put on makeup. But that didn't matter now. I wanted to honor my dear son's last wish. With that single-minded determination, I hurried to the address in John's letter. It led me to a rental storage facility not far from my home. Among the rows of warehouses, I found the one numbered in the letter. Inserting a thin, small key attached to the letter into the lock, I opened the warehouse door. The small room, about the size of 100 square feet max, was dimly lit and slightly musty, despite it being daytime. As I turned on the switch next to the door, the bare fluorescent light buzzed to life, illuminating the interior. What is this? The room, gradually brightening, revealed a desk covered with scattered photos. Around it, notes littered the floor, along with notebooks and empty plastic bottles. The scene was bizarre, hard to believe those were used by John. He was always organized and tidy, unlike this mess. A sense of fear instinctively gripped me, shaking my entire body. I'm about to see something I shouldn't. Facing the unsettling scene, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I finally looked at the photos on the desk, my eyes fixated on them. There was Sarah, not alone, but holding hands intimately with an unknown man. Looking at the other photos, each one captured those two together. Undoubtedly, they were proof of cheating. As I had suspected from the letter's words, Sarah was the cause of John's stress. There might have been some stress from work, but unquestionably, it was Sarah's actions that drove John to end his life. While trying to calm my trembling body, I frantically started going through the notes and notebooks. The notebook, in fine handwriting, detailed dates and times, what Sarah said to John, and how she treated him. February 13th at 2:30 p.m. She called me useless. February 23rd at 8:24 p.m. She hit me. The details were horrific, each line a scream from my heart. Why didn't I notice? Why didn't John tell me anything? The more I fought, the more whys filled my head. Alongside John's own writings, there were what seemed to be reports from a private investigator. The photos, too, were likely taken by someone he had hired to investigate Sarah's infidelity. Inside an envelope on the desk, I found several USB drives. I gathered them, along with the other evidence, into my bag and closed the warehouse door. I couldn't stay any longer. The place felt thick with John's resentment, attacking even me, his mother. John, I'm so sorry. Hatred for Sarah, who had transformed my son so drastically, solidified my resolve for revenge. Why did John have to suffer like this? Why didn't he seek help from anyone? I vowed to find the answers and avenge John's unfulfilled grievances. Back home, I went through the awful treatment and evidence of infidelity John had left behind. I panicked several times, feeling sick. The pain was unbearable. Regrets about not being able to do anything kept flooding in, and I couldn't stop the tears. Even if I avenged him, John wouldn't come back. But I couldn't stop now. I forced myself to think about what to do with the evidence. The police would soon come to inquire. Should I hand these over to them? No, that seems too lenient. John had taken his life, tormented by Sarah and her lover's betrayal. What should I do to ensure John rests in peace? Just then, the doorbell rang, signaling a visitor. Was it the police? Looking at the intercom camera, I saw a familiar face.
Hello, it's Johnson.
The young man on the camera was Johnson Smith. Johnson is John's friend since high school. I opened the door, and Johnson's face was the awkward face. I invited Johnson inside and led him to John's room. Johnson took out some sweets from his paper bag and gazed at John's photo. He prayed intently for a while, then turned back to me. His face had changed from earlier. It seemed like he had made some kind of resolution. Johnson adjusted his glasses with his left hand and reached into his pocket, pulling out a letter. Johnson took out a letter and handed it over to me. It was identical to the one I had received from John.
This letter is from John. I was informed that it has reached you as well.
Besides me, John had also sent a letter to Johnson, asking for revenge against Sarah. As a mother, I might still consider it, but involving someone else like Johnson in this matter is unthinkable. Though it pains me to go against John's wish, I had to convey just that. However, Johnson denied this, saying,
Even if we talk about revenge, I have no intention of breaking the law. I'm sure John wouldn't want that either.
Hearing Johnson say this made me realize something. What was I thinking? I had been swept away by the idea of revenge in the shock of losing John. Although I didn't have a clear plan, I feared what I might have done if I were alone. Perhaps John also thought of this, which is why he left a letter for Johnson too.
At the funeral, I handed it to you, but let me do it again.
Johnson continued, taking out a business card case from his pocket. The card he gave me had Johnson's name and his work details.
I couldn't talk to you in detail at that time and just handed you my business card rather abruptly.
Thinking back, I indeed received his business card at the funeral. He used to come over to our house several times since high school and even attended John's wedding party. Why he gave me the business card at this time, I remembered thinking, but I was too shocked to check it then. I hadn't paid attention to Johnson's words at that moment. He had definitely said,
Please contact me if you're in trouble.
The business card read Johnson Law Office. I recalled it. Johnson had pursued a career in law after graduating from high school. He had visited our home even after that, but all I knew was that he was working in New York. I never imagined that Johnson had become a lawyer. Accepting John's letter, Johnson had decided to seek revenge within the bounds of the law. Johnson, having lost a dear friend, had made this resolution and came to visit me.
My office is closed for a while,
he said, smiling for the first time. It was a nostalgic smile. Johnson wanted to help me and John as a friend. He didn't want to accept payment. Along with the letter, a substantial retainer fee arrived from John through registered mail with cash. But Johnson handed it all back to me.
I can't accept this. This is the least I can do, having been unable to help him. Please let me do this job as his friend.
Johnson said that. I hastily stopped him and decided to keep the money for the time being. Not only I but also Johnson had struggled with our inability to save John. So I should consider Johnson's feelings as well. I told Johnson about the contents of John's letter and the items I found in the storage. But let's take a break for now. You must be tired from the long journey. Shall we have some tea first? Johnson might be feeling the same urgency, but we had found a strong ally in each other. That was true for both of us. We needed to calm down first. Feeling this, I decided to welcome Johnson as my son's friend. As Johnson looked through the documents I handed him, he let out a deep sigh.
This is tough,
he said, a statement that could be interpreted as either a remark to me or a spontaneous utterance. The man Sarah was having an affair with was named Brian Taylor. According to the notes left by John, it seems that Brian, too, knew John. Brian had been threatening John repeatedly to break up with Sarah and had continued to harass him. Johnson, being knowledgeable in law, stated that Brian was as guilty as Sarah. Even if they denied the affair, there were photos and evidence left by John. This should be enough to build a strong case.
As a lawyer, I can't do much in court, but I do have the knowledge.
Holding the two people responsible for pushing John to the brink would mean the end of Johnson's role as a lawyer in this matter. That's because he has no intention of defending those two. Then the next step would be to organize the evidence John left behind and submit it to the police. Also, demanding a significant amount in damages from them would be part of the plan.
We will submit what John left to the police and bring those two to justice,
Johnson affirmed, as if convincing himself. He needed to say this to maintain his composure. I explained to Johnson that the police were scheduled to question me soon. With all this evidence, Sarah and Brian would face some punishment, no matter what they say. However, I desperately wanted to talk to Sarah directly. As John's mother, I felt it was my duty to confront her. I told Johnson that I wanted to talk to Sarah without revealing the existence of the evidence. Johnson readily agreed, saying, "Of course." Once Johnson submits the evidence to the police, there might be no more chance to talk to Sarah. The police could come to me at any time. The time left must be short. I decided to go to Sarah's house immediately. Sarah showed a look of confusion when I suddenly visited her without any prior communication. She must have thought I was still recovering from the shock of the funeral. She had shown her true nature over the phone before, which must have made her feel guilty. She must have been internally panicking about what I would say. "I've heard everything from John. He is never coming back. But apologize right now. Apologize to John." Seeing Sarah leading a normal life even now, my patience reached its limit. I realized I was speaking before I knew it.
What are you talking about? Why should I apologize to John? What did I do?
Sarah's face froze for a moment in shock, and then she became hysterical. Her reaction told me she had been restless these past weeks. She has been constantly worried about when her committed sins would be exposed. She reacted sensitively to my words because she couldn't deceive me. She might be able to deceive the police during questioning since they don't know the truth, but she can't fool me. "I've heard everything from John. Your affair with a man named Brian, all the terrible things you've done to John. It's all your fault. You took John away from me." I carefully chose my words and confronted Sarah. As expected, she became more agitated.
I don't know. I haven't done anything."
Sarah covered her ears with her hands and shook her head. Her mental state had already been shattered. My visit completely broke her. She collapsed on the spot, crying and repeating,
I'm sorry.
"Why didn't I realize this sooner?" If she was this weak, she might have changed her attitude towards John if I had been stronger. Thinking about how such the person had tormented John made me feel empty. I called Johnson right there and told him everything that had happened. Johnson chose to explain everything to the police right there. He seemed taken aback by how quickly everything was resolved, a bit bewildered. He had expected Sarah to resist more and never admit her guilt. However, the outcome was unexpectedly straightforward. It later became clear that Sarah had never considered that John would take his own life. She thought her harassment would lead John to initiate a divorce. Without evidence of the affair, she believed there was no need to pay alimony, and she intended to deny the affair altogether, claiming Brian was just a friend. It was a crazy plan, but both she and Brian believed it would work. John, out of love for Sarah, had not sued based on the evidence he had gathered. John was hoping for remorse and a severing of ties with Brian. He had been gathering evidence. But it seems that the realization dawned that this wish would not be fulfilled. He could have taken revenge himself, but John was so cornered that he couldn't make sound judgments. He couldn't bring himself to sue Sarah. Unaware of John's kindness, Sarah continued to push him to the edge. Following Johnson's call, the police arrived promptly, and Sarah, along with Taylor, was subject to another round of questioning. The evidence left by John soon exposed their crimes. Sarah, since then, hasn't been able to speak properly. Even after being found guilty and sent to a police hospital, she remains in a state of shock. This story became news, quickly spreading the crimes of Brian and Sarah across the nation. They were recognized as the cause of John's death. Johnson's efforts ensured a flawless claim for damages. Unsurprisingly, Brian lost his job. His crimes became known among his company and friends, leaving him completely isolated. Even if he re-enters society, he will have to continue paying the alimony and remain a subject of rumors for his grave misdeeds. They committed such grave crimes. Sarah remains unwell, with no hope of recovery. Constantly repeating, "I'm sorry," and unable to sleep without medication. The guilt of the two was revealed, and they faced justice according to the law. However, John will not return. Did we fulfill his last wish? After ensuring the conviction of the two individuals, Johnson decided to return to New York.
Thank you for everything. I don't know if we completely honored John's feelings, but we tried our best,
he said with a somber expression. Having a friend like you, John, was fortunate. Thank you so much. I replied with deep gratitude. Johnson, slightly flustered, responded,
I just did what I could as his friend. Please, no need for such formalities.
With a smile, Johnson walked away. Without him, I might have lost my composure, driven by anger. He managed to stay calm and bring them to justice, hiding his own turmoil. Although Johnson wasn't looking at me anymore, I continued to watch his retreating figure for a while. Later, Johnson started a volunteer organization to help people with various legal troubles, providing relief without financial concerns. His inability to save John must have been incredibly frustrating. To this day, he continues this work alongside his job, helping many people. Just a few weeks ago, he came by to see me again. During that visit, he introduced me to his wife and their newborn child. Despite his busy schedule, he makes sure to visit a few times a year. John must be delighted. As for myself, I quit a part-time job I had since then. I felt compelled to do something only I could do, despite not having the knowledge or power like Johnson. That's when I decided to volunteer in mental health care for families who have lost loved ones. I joined an organization founded by a psychiatrist living nearby and began facing various people and their struggles. Johnson's support saved me, helping me recover from the loss of John. Just like I was sinking in despair, I wanted to help others who felt the same way. This motivated me to start my volunteer work. As I continued, I realized this was where I belonged. It wasn't just about saving families engulfed in grief, but possibly preventing others from ending up like my son. Driven by this conviction, I grew closer to the psychiatrist who established the organization. I never planned for this. It made me feel guilty towards my late husband and John. Is it okay for me to be happy only myself? With this newfound acceptance, I cautiously began a new relationship. Even if I fall in love again in the future, I will never forget my husband or John. I intend to live my life carrying the memories and sentiments of both of them with me. So, is it all right for me to embrace happiness again?